All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave, reading Crime and Punishment Part 5 this week. What did you guys think? What's your first impressions?
So dramatic.
Lots of drunkenness.
Yeah.
Lots of verbal fights.
I gotta say, Mr. Lebeziatnikov became a bit of a hero in this section, and I am quite pleased with how that unfolded.
Yeah, he was a peculiar character off the start.
Yeah, and we've got Svidrigailov or whatever.
There's Svidrigailov and Lebeznyakov. I think that's how you say their names.
I disagree, and I also don't know how.
I think you're wrong, and so am I.
Where to start? Where did it start? How did it start?
It started with Peter Petrovich Lushin and this Lebeznyakov character, his roommate, having a little squabble in their room because they share the dorm.
Quite right. On the day of the funeral of Marmeladov.
Yes.
I found this chapter, section, whatever you want to call it, good. I found it to be a much easier time getting through than the previous sections because it didn't focus so much on Rodion Roskilnikov's depression and depressing Garrett and his turmoil. And it's finally he's turning the page and confiding in Sonia or Sophia, however you want to call her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's coming into terms of his own actions, and sort of like in chapter 4, he is visiting Sonia and kind of like before, where he was talking to her and they were having these conversations about, being a good person, and based on what I recall.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 4, Rokosinov is sort of like giving his farewell to her, and she is slowly coming to realize his own actions. Like there's a paragraph here that the author writes as soon as Rokosinov enters, I think, at the hospital or something. It's a really long paragraph, but here it is. She sank helplessly on the bed with her face in the pillows, but a moment later she got up, moved quickly to him, seized both his hands, and gripping them tight on her thin fingers, began looking into his face again with the same intent stare. In this last desperate look, she tried to look into him and catch some last hope. But there was no hope. There was no doubt remaining. It was all true. Later on, indeed, when she recalled that moment, she thought it was strange and wondered why she had seen at once that there was no doubt. She could not have said, for instance, that she had foreseen something of the sort. And yet now, as soon as he told her, she suddenly fancied that she had really foreseen this very thing. Very whimsical.
Poof, 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 poof,
Yeah.
poof. Do you get that reference when I say poof, poof?
No, what do you mean by that?
I don't really know, but Katerina Ivanovna in Frenzy was talking about her father, the general, the German or whatever, major corporal, whatever the heck she fantasized he was, that he was this estimable man who would say poof, poof.
Yeah, I remember that now that you mention it.
Oh, poof, poof, poof.
I don't know what it meant, but he would always seem like a man who said poof poof.
It's just hilarious. But yeah, that
you definitely get a look into a mental breakdown there with Katerina's adventure.
That was so rapid and quick and bizarre.
Yeah. But going back to chapter 4 just for a second, you also have the moment where he compares himself to Napoleon again when he's talking to Sonia. And then almost immediately after, he compares himself to a louse too. Do you see that inner conflict?
Yeah, he started to break down that failed belief that he was a Superman, and kind of came to terms with the fact that he was committing the crime to test if he was a Superman, and had discovered that he wasn't, and is finally coming to terms with that reality.
So do you think the reality he's coming to terms with is that his theory was wrong and there are no supermen, or just he doesn't fall into that category of extraordinary men?
Yes. I think probably the latter, though, without being cynical. I really think that he may have been onto something, that there are men that will cross any bridge to achievement, and that he certainly isn't one of them. And perhaps it's not even the man that makes the super, but the context that the man lives in.
He would go to greater lengths to find it.
Yeah, like, I don't know. I can't speak to Napoleon, but I'm sure that if you've got a pope telling you that you need to do this or that or the other thing, and you face threat of exile, it puts you in an interesting niche spot where you do what you must because you think you ought to. But that's not where Rodion was.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting comparison of him being Napoleon and all that. I guess there's some part of him that doesn't want to let this go, but at the same time, he also has to come into terms of what he's done.
Yeah, even at his last, he's still kind of refusing the notion of going to Siberia and facing punishment. And that's why Sonia holds off on giving him the cross, because he's not ready to bear it, but he is bracing himself for that ultimate reality and destiny of confessing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is why this is one of these novels that should be read once. You can't just read it casually over and over again and say, oh, wow, this is a great novel. This is for everybody to read.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where you read it and you're like, okay, I got through it. Makes sense. I agree. I disagree. I'm not going to reread it. It's not enjoyable. Enjoyable is not the term I use to describe this book. It's necessary.
It's psychological, too.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I keep saying, it's interesting. It's not intriguing, though.
That's a good way to put it. But I definitely understand why it's on Jordan Peterson's reading list.
Yeah, I think you need to be able to, in a safe space, explore the concepts that are impressed upon the reader through this adventure of dismal proportion, because it makes it a lot easier to understand, the impacts of these things. Perhaps if you're completely ignorant to the notion that you have a consciousness, and when you commit things that go against your own moral compass, you suffer for it. Reading Rodia's descent into decay and destruction and damnation is a good thing to have on the resume. Like, oh yeah, I know that murder's bad now, for sure, no doubt.
Yeah, the book also explores the concept of poor man's pride.
Heavily in this section.
Yeah. When Katerina just spends the last of all of her money on this funeral because she somehow gets it into her head that Marmeladov was a great man and deserves a great funeral like that of a army general or something. I don't know.
I think it was more about posturing, that she thinks that she is of noble, dare say almost aristocratic descent, that
Yes,
this
poof,
is
poof.
the way, poof, poof, poof. This is the way things must be done. This is the classist presentation of a funeral and a dinner, that this is how it's supposed to go, and she's of that caste, and this is what is expected of her. And in reality, it's her pride and her own consumption that is overtaken her, and it leads to her own destruction.
Yeah. And you see her invite like all the lodgers to the funeral, and barely any of them show up. Just a few Polish guys.
And then the ones that do show up, she insults just ridiculously. And she's excited to see Rhodia just so that she can continue to gossip and complain about these people. And it's like,
yeah, and
when you
see
look
that
at these,
when all the fancy people show up, she just flocks to them. Like when Peter shows up and when Rhodia shows up, she's ecstatic about it.
When your own standard of self-worth doesn't come from anything internal, and you have to base it upon the external activities and events and presentations and company that you give and have and receive, it's destructive, and that comes to light quite clearly. That had Katerina known who she was and what she valued and had a simple, modest funeral, she wouldn't have been kicked out of her lodgings. She wouldn't have gotten into these fights, and she wouldn't have beat her children and dressed them up in turbans and made them dance and sing on the streets in an absurd, backwards effort to shame the major that kicked her out.
Yeah. That part was a little bit disturbing to read.
Yeah. I'm glad it came to an end quickly.
Yeah, this was a very short part of the novel.
From what I understand, there is another version of the publishing that has 7 sections, and the final chapter of the 5th section becomes section 6 and is expanded upon incredibly.
I didn't know that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I cheated. I read some background on it.
What was that like?
Oh no, I didn't actually read the actual section. I just found out of its existence, and I dare not read it. I couldn't deal with a 7th section.
Just read the wiki, eh?
Yeah, the whole Spark Notes.
Well, I'm glad we're getting to the end of this novel. I sure like to see how this will be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to read the epilogue?
Oh, we might as well. We'll include that in the last video.
Okay.
So, what's your takeaway from this part? I know that Rukosonov is coming to a point where he can no longer sustain his philosophy, his own egotistical behavior, just to prove what he's capable of, and that Sonia is pushing him away. She knows now what he's done, and along with this sort of behavior, that it's affecting the other characters too, specifically in like a class-based sense. And it's sort of like a profound revelation that's occurring here. What one has to slowly realize in order to find out what they want to obtain afterward. I guess that, if that makes sense.
I see a lot of James Taggart's personality from Atlas Shrugged coming through in this section. The notion that because you want something to be the way you want it to be isn't actually a reason or a means to get what you want or think you deserve. And that when you allow yourself to be clouded by the BS that manifests in your mind and allow that to become the reality you perceive and begin to wish that somehow things would work out. Like in the case of Katerina, like I don't know what she expected was going to happen when she hosted a dinner with guests that she despised, but clearly it wasn't her own death and being evicted. And I think that when you're not grounded in reality, you destroy your own reality, and you don't see that happening until it is so hard and concrete that there isn't even an escape from it. Poof, poof.
Yep, it goes poof, poof.
Maybe that's what the poof poof metaphor is. It's just creating your own reality.
Poof, poof. Again, it's not a conversation starter. Like, we've all read this section and we're all sitting here saying, well, what do we even think of it? And when we do have a good thought, it doesn't continue the conversation. It's just like, yeah, I concur.
Yeah.
Case in point.
There's a lot of parts in this book that are like kind of subtle in what they're like trying to get you to think, even though the subject matter is not subtle at all. Like, it's a book about why you shouldn't kill people. Everything else is just tiny little hints of things. Like the little situation with Luzhin trying to accuse Sonia of stealing the 100-ruble note when he planted it on her and made her have a little mental breakdown because of it. Like, what do you think his motivations for that are?
Well, his motivations were clearly laid out by Rodion to prove that she was this destitute thief and perhaps put himself in a better light with Dunya and whatever Rodia's mom's name is. but pulchera. But that's the thing. Like, it's this weird, foggy reality that Pyotr Petrovich is living in, where he thinks that he can contort the world to his own design to make people feel a certain way about him, when in reality, your actions speak louder than your words. And when you do conspiracy-driven madness, people look at you and say, "You're absurd. Go away." And I think that's one of the bigger takeaways out of this whole thing, is that when you are full of BS, that's all you get. You reap what you sow, and moral posturing be damned. It's your actions that matter. You could be the most impolite individual when you're talking to people, but if your actions are good, then you're going to be valued based on that.
And slowly but surely, your own reality becomes a reality, and that reality turns against you.
Yeah. You need to be objective in these situations. You can't pretend that you're better than you are and expect the world to treat you that way.
You have to be neutral.
You have
Or
to know your
positive.
worth. You have to know your worth.
And I think that's why philosophy is so important. If you don't know philosophy, I was talking about this to my wife last night, that if you didn't learn philosophy firsthand, you fall into the trap of acting out a philosophy you don't even know or understand because you've learned it through nurture. And it's that old adage, the path to hell is lined with good intentions. And sure, the intentions can be good, but if they're not founded and grounded in philosophy and reason and understanding, if you don't have those values as part of who you are, then you're going to act out a very shitty scene.
Yeah, definitely.
And they should be teaching philosophy at a much younger age.
Mm-hmm. One of the people in the Akira chat put up a message saying, "Hey, check out this book, Underground History of American Education." Looks pretty cool so far. Basically makes the case that for hundreds of years we didn't have education and people were smart. Now that we do have an education program, people are stupid.
Like, there was no educational system for hundreds of years.
I think it's trying to just make the case for libertarian forms of education. I just read a couple of the headings. I haven't gotten into it so far, but
Take a farmer's son, right? And he's grown up on the farm and he's learned how to operate machines and fix machines and deal with livestock and pump the well and repair the well and fix the electrical. Take him away from the farm and have him go apply to a different farm that isn't family owned. And immediately the question is, well, where is your certificates? Where's your education? And a learned lifestyle of understanding now all of a sudden doesn't mean anything, because in our institutionalized society, you need a piece of paper from a board that says that you're capable. And it doesn't matter that you grew up on a farm and learned all these things. And so I can see where they're coming from in that sense. But education does definitely benefit us. I mean, around tax season, you always see people freaking out about how they learned about parabolas and not how to do taxes. And
Yeah.
But it's like, it's not hard to learn how to do taxes. And you learned how to do math, and you learned how to read, and you learned how to go to a library to check out books and how to ask people for help. But for some reason, individuals, I see them, they think that because they weren't taught it, they should not have to learn it. And it's like, well, we're in a society, at least in North America, where you can go to a computer at a library and you can learn how to do just about anything. Taxes are one of the simpler things. And so freaking out at the school system for not teaching taxes, I find, is a little ridiculous.
yeah, then they'd put all the taxmen out of work. What about the guys that get paid to do your taxes? What are they gonna do?
Yeah, like what about the guy that went to university for 4 years to be a certified personal accountant that is literally paid to do taxes, and you're crying that you don't know how to do your taxes?
I think there would still be people that didn't know how to do their taxes even if it wasn't school.
Exactly. It's an it's free will. You have the free will to think or to not to think. And if you choose not to think and to say, oh, well, I wasn't taught that, and so, well, damn you.
Yeah.
And plus, you should be able to pursue what you're interested in and not take any default courses. Sure, they're probably going to be beneficial down the line, but you're not going to be able to attend those subjects every day of your life. You're not going to be able to learn how to do linear algebra when you're writing papers all the time. You could write something about linear algebra, but what are the odds? What are the chances of you stumbling upon linear algebra when you are focused more entirely on just writing about different subjects, writing about MFAs or how to get an MFA in English or creative writing, the concepts of creative writing, or vice versa?
Exactly. And there's something to be said about not having to learn anything except for the thing that you're quite interested in and doing so well in that field that you make enough money that you can pay other people to do the things that you need to get done.
I also think the other thing is, I think in regards to being able to pursue what you want to do, and also this attachment of learning our education by default, this is just my own interpretation of it, but I think the reason why many people are stuck in their own learning circles or whatever you want to call it is because, and not being able to learn about taxes or entrepreneurship of that sort, is probably because there's competition involved and they don't want you to know the secrets about an easier way to pay off your taxes or an easier way to develop a product or a service or a company. They want you to stay in the middle ground or the lower ground. And I think that's what's going on, because in the end of it all, how else can you succeed if you don't know what the actual purpose of learning what you want to do, or if that makes sense?
I think I'd argue that. I'd say, first of all, they don't exist. Second of all, I'd say there's a tendency for a large group of people to go to where they're most comfortable, and that not everybody wants to be successful, and not everybody wants to know what they don't know. They're much more comfortable knowing they don't know it and crying that that's the issue with their life, that they didn't get this lesson, that they didn't understand, and so their ignorance somehow absolves them of their guilt, and that's not true in any capacity. And
I think that's what we have to teach people, is that that's not true.
yeah, like there's no they don't exist, they don't care about you.
We need to teach people how to be an individual instead of a piece of your society. Like, that part's important too. You need to learn how to function within your society and your culture, but you need to be an individual too.
Yeah.
And perhaps we will learn how best to go about that in one of our later reads, The 12 Rules to Live by Jordan Peterson.
12 Rules for Life.
Rules for life.
Antidote for chaos.
That's the one.
It'll be a learning process.
As far as Brody is concerned, I have not much more to say on the subject.
Yeah, it's like I said, we're getting to some sort of revelation here, and we'll see how that unfolds in the last part of the book. I'll finally be relieved when this is all over.
Hear, hear. Poof, poof.
Poof, poof.